This program contains coarse language.
We've had a catastrophic failure of national policy making, and we've had a catastrophic failure of the national energy market. Blind Freddy saw this coming. I mean, it's only those who are neglectful or deceitful, or those who just didn't want to face the problem, who haven't known that this has been coming for a long time.
We've had a series of disasters, bad political decisions to end up where we are, and I suspect that there's a lot more bad decisions to come.
Everyone keeps blaming everyone else, and I would love, as a consumer of electricity, I'd love both sides of government to come out and just find a solution rather than blame everyone else.
Welcome to Four Corners. By any measure, Australia is an energy superpower. We're the world's largest exporter of coal. We have abundant sources of renewable energy. And by 2020, Australia will be the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. And yet, this apparently lucky country is now in the grip of an energy crisis. There are predictions that consumers could be facing a 30% increase in their power bills by the end of next month. Industry is seeing the price it pays for gas double or even triple. There are warnings manufacturers will be forced to close shop. Meanwhile, old coal-fired power stations are closing, and the electricity networks are so fragile that some states are already experiencing blackouts. So how did it come to this? As Michael Brissenden reports, the chief culprit has been the failure of governments on both sides to put politics aside and plan for the nation's energy security.
The storm in the Australian electricity system has been brewing for years. But it took one wild night in South Australia to turbocharge the politics of power across the nation.
We are upgrading our warning to include an area of destructive winds, so wind gusts possibly up to 140 kilometres an hour.
South Australia reels under an onslaught of heavy rain and devastating blackouts.
We've experienced some weather conditions that have not been seen before in this state.
SES crews brace for flooding from already saturated catchments.
On the 28th of September last year, South Australia was isolated from the national electricity grid, the first statewide blackout in Australia in more than 50 years. As the storm raged on, the scale of the crisis was becoming apparent. Emergency services were overwhelmed by calls for help. Roads were chaotic. Lifts were stuck. Trams and trains stopped running. And there were fears of a breakdown of civil order.
It was obviously a massive shock. We were in Parliament House and the lights flickered. Of course, there's a generator there, so we weren't fully aware until we received the news that there'd been a statewide blackout. So yeah, it was one of those signal moments.
When that storm hit, the transmission lines folded like they were made of plasticine. When the transmission lines hit the ground, that created some really significant problems of voltage. Some of the wind farms turned themselves off. The role of the interconnector between Victoria and South Australia became critical. It got overloaded and it turned itself off to protect itself against what were extreme fluctuations in voltage. End result was the whole state went basically black.
Further down the line, on the now brittle fringes of the power network, the fishing town of Port Lincoln was bracing itself.
You could physically see the front as it come through. It was very ominous. It's threatening. You look at it and you think this is not going to end well.
Greg Napier is the local country fire service captain. In the first hours, he started to anticipate the risks that might be coming.
How much water has the hospital got? Do we have people out in the community now that are on dialysis that now have no water, or home dialysis, no power, no water? Do we need to be door knocking? How do we communicate with the hospitals? We're going to run out of phones. The radio network's going to go down. All of those things. Once we understood that we'd lost some very large infrastructure in the mid-north and that we were going to be without power in this community for quite some time, you start to realise you are looking at the long game. And then it's access to fuel for emergency services, water supplies to the community. Supermarkets were running low. The fuel queue here, from memory, I think was about 1.5 kilometres. Cash was the flavour of the 3 days. Obviously the ATM shut down.
We're at the end of a long, thin, weak network. Right at the end down here at Eyre Peninsula.
A little further down the road, Craig McCarthy was watching the temperatures rise in his fish freezers.
I actually drove down to the council in desperation looking for the mayor. And I couldn't find him because the lights were out. I managed to get a truck from Adelaide to come drive all the way over and load up 2 trailer loads of frozen and take it back and organise cold storage back in Adelaide, 8 hours away.
Right. And if you hadn't done that, what would
if I hadn't done that, the whole lot of stock would have been written off by then. Give it another day, that's it.
Basically, we just had no power. So went bang and we had darkness. And then, next 2.5 days we sat around looking after food, looking after produce, sending staff home.
Port Lincoln had now been without power for almost 3 days. The blackout cost cafe owner Chris Bunder $25,000 in lost revenue and loss of stock. A lot of money with margins as tight as they are in the restaurant business.
And it's not just me that loses. You know, I've got 27 staff and a lot of them are casual, so they just didn't get wages for 2.5 days. So the economy doesn't just affect me, it affects the whole of Port Lincoln and the state, because there's no money changing hands. There's no... These people have lost wages.
The business sector in South Australia says the storm cost more than $300 million. How did a country rich in coal, gas, sunshine and wind end up in what some are describing as an existential energy crisis? It's a complicated story, but it's the end result of an ageing energy system undermined by rapidly changing technology, global efforts to limit climate change, and above all else, a decade of public policy failure. In the well-lit corridors of political power, the blame games began almost immediately. Don't waste a crisis is one of the first rules of spin, and the nation's politicians weren't about to let this one go unnoticed. The federal government was quick to suggest the rapid injection of renewables had weakened the energy system in South Australia.
So variable renewable energy made the South Australian grid very vulnerable. Very, very vulnerable indeed to breaches in transmission lines and any overloading or pressure on the interconnector with Victoria, which, as you know, is bringing in coal-fired power from the Latrobe Valley.
The Liberals and the Nationals, I think quite cynically, are trying to take a disaster which has hit the state and use it for their own political purposes.
South Australia has led the way on renewable energy. The question is, has it undermined the system? It's still a fiercely contested point.
The reality is that intermittent sources of power, particularly wind and solar, do not have the same qualities that baseload power, which is generated from coal and gas and indeed from hydropower, have.
But it didn't have an
above
impact
40%.
in this case, though, did it? I mean,
Well,
regardless of that, that may be the case.
It has.
But in this case, it didn't have an
It
impact.
has contributed to the weakening of South Australia's electricity system. That has been repeated by various agencies in this space.
Well, it's simply false. I mean, the cause of the blackout was not due to renewable energy. It's as simple as that.
The report found that there were a series of events related to the storm, tornadoes that hit the transmission grid, and in a very short period, probably shorter than almost before I finished this question, the system went blacked out.
A report by the energy market operator found the settings on the wind farms were too sensitive, but the intermittent nature of wind generation was not to blame. The most well-known characteristic of wind power, variation of output with wind strength, often termed intermittency, was not a material factor in the events immediately prior to the black system.
It wasn't the injection of renewables. What the report reviewed was that there were control systems that were on the wind generators that caused the wind generators to shut off when we would have liked them to keep running. If it were a gas plant and the gas plant tripped off, it would have been the same event. So I think it's just wrong to sort of say it's a single technology. These are very complex systems. You can have major climatic events that affect these systems, and the role of operators really is to take a look at what happened and say, okay, how can we fix this going forward?
The Australian grid is one of the biggest electricity networks in the world, sometimes referred to as the world's biggest machine. Poles and wires deliver power from the source. It's almost 5,000 kilometres end to end, stretching from Port Douglas in the far north to Hobart in the south and west to Port Lincoln. It's a 20th century grid facing a 21st century challenge, the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy.
What we found in South Australia, and really what we're seeing and need to be addressing throughout the country, is that we have different types of resources. Therefore, if we do the same things like we've always done with these different types of resources, some people would say that's the sort of definition of insanity.
Old coal-fired power stations are reaching the end of their lives. The shift to new renewable generation is underway. Every attempt to address the problems this has presented has been plagued by a lack of planning and political argument. Is it your view that renewables is essentially what's undermined the system?
No, I don't think renewables have undermined the system. I think the failure of politics has undermined the system. We're actually applying
Danny Price is an energy analyst with a long pedigree. A former advisor on energy and emissions trading to Malcolm Turnbull when he was opposition leader, he's now advising the South Australian government. He says it's taken too long to recognise the severity of the problem.
Even up until late 2014, the Australian Energy Market Operator was advising governments that everything was tickety-boo, but it wasn't. We needed to make some changes. We needed to make some decisions about how to manage a system with greater renewables.
Climate and energy policy has been a searing, destructive current through the nation's politics. For a decade, the fight has been over limiting emissions by putting a price on carbon. It's divided the major political parties and torn down political leaders. Kevin Rudd put climate change at the top of the political agenda in 2007.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
John Howard, under pressure, promised action.
We are taking action to address greenhouse emissions and climate change.
As Prime Minister, Rudd then backflipped on his policy answer, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. The Greens, under Christine Milne, killed that chance. They wouldn't support the bill in the Senate because they said it didn't go far enough. And of course, Tony Abbott's relentless political attack on climate policy positions of his own side and Labor.
What the Rudd government ETS looks like is a great big tax.
Then came Julia Gillard's rhetorical sleight of hand.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
So we've had a series of disasters, bad political decisions to end up where we are, and I suspect that there's a lot more bad decisions to come.
Well, the policy environment couldn't have been an unhappier one. My recommendations and what was embodied in legislation in 2011 involved the continuation of a renewable energy target, but a carbon price that would gradually take over the role, so the renewable energy target would be redundant.
Ross Garner was first commissioned to examine the economic impact of climate change in 2007. His recommendation back then was for a carbon price, and it remained a central plank of his advice to both the Rudd and Gillard governments.
So it would have, for example, favoured gas over coal. Getting rid of the carbon price put all the weight on the renewable energy target, which draws no distinction between really dirty coal, lignite, black coal and gas, and treats them all as non-renewable. So it's a much less sensitive mechanism than emissions pricing.
It didn't work the first time around, but I think it's almost universally accepted within industry that we do have to find a way to put a price on carbon. I mean, that's just the reality that we have to do, and that just makes political and policy sense.
Climate policy has also been a defining theme for Malcolm Turnbull and a challenge to many in his own party. His support for Kevin Rudd's climate policies cost him his job as opposition leader in 2009.
For me, it was a matter of integrity and principle, because I had reached an agreement in good faith with the Labor Party, led by Kevin Rudd, to support an emissions trading scheme.
Now, under pressure again from within, he's taking a different tack, to the dismay of some who know him well.
I genuinely thought that Malcolm Turnbull was the guy that would deliver a sensible outcome to, and I think most other people thought he was a conviction politician, and I know that he knows and understands this very well. He's a smart guy. Clearly it's politics that's driving him, and it's extremely disappointing that we can't overcome that in this country.
Although they won't commit to a carbon price, the federal government is scrambling for solutions. The big thinking so far has produced an ambitious plan to expand the Snowy Hydro scheme.
Subject, obviously, to the feasibility being completed and all of the analysis being completed.
Energy is a powerful political motivator. Domestic energy prices are a hot-button voter issue. The Prime Minister saw the political opportunity and kicked off the political year, determined to make it one of the defining themes.
Labor's policies mean higher power prices and energy insecurity. The battle lines have been drawn. It's clear that the coalition stands for cheaper energy.
If he wants to pick that fight, fine.
One factor driving the politics of the last decade was the concern that a price on carbon would increase domestic electricity prices. But not having a carbon price is now one of the big factors affecting bills.
Already we're seeing massive price rises across the eastern seaboard. I expect that by June, retail electricity price rises could be in the order of 20 to 30%, which is an unprecedented rise. And that's simply because there's a shortage of supply in generation, and that's simply because the market can't respond because of the lack of any carbon price. They don't know what is going to be economic, so they've chosen to do nothing, which is completely rational, but not very good for consumers.
Electricity pricing is fiendishly complicated. The national electricity market is where wholesale power is traded. Prices can vary dramatically from state to state in the space of 5 minutes, depending on supply and demand. What is clear is that electricity prices have been rising, with several factors contributing to that rise. Upgrades to poles and wires, coal-fired power stations shutting, and a system relying on more expensive gas.
There's a white paper on energy in 2004, and that white paper boasted that Australia had the lowest energy costs in the OECD. Now we've got the 27th lowest. And that's a remarkably bad achievement for in the last 12 years. We are about to go past Japan in energy costs. It imports 97% of its energy needs. It is remarkable how much we have stuffed up energy policy in this country.
Central to the politics of power is the Paris Agreement, an international climate change accord to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, a goal many believe will require countries like Australia to reach zero net emissions by 2050. Our 2030 emissions targets have been set, but the federal government doesn't seem confident it can meet the 2050 aspirations.
We have signed on to getting a 26 to 28% emissions reduction target by 2030. We'll get to a zero net emissions over the course of this century would be a good achievement, but technology will be the key. That's why the government is investing record amounts.
So it sounds like you don't think we'll get there by 2050.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, Michael, but what I do have is an ability to say to you that the government is absolutely committed to a lower emissions future, meeting its 2030 targets and ensuring that the integration of renewable energy into the system is one which is done in a stable way, in a way that provides affordable power and a lower emissions footprint.
We need to be zero carbon by 2050 or before. We need a plan and a process to have our ageing coal-fired power plants replaced with clean energy over time. That's important not just for energy security, but for the communities which they depend on.
For 52 years, Hazelwood was the beating heart of the Latrobe Valley communities. It helped keep the lights on across the state of Victoria and provided jobs for 750 workers.
I love this place, and I think all the operators feel pretty much the same about it. We've nursed this thing along for years because, we've all known that this day is coming, but it's still shock.
Gail McAllister spent most of her working life there. Hazelwood was one of Australia's oldest and dirtiest coal plants. It's an industrial time warp, a technology from a long-gone era, but emblematic of the shift that's underway in power generation across the globe.
I think renewables are a great thing. The problem I have with them is that it wasn't a fair market the way they were introduced. So there's no way that coal could compete with the renewables because the renewables were so heavily subsidised.
Big, inefficient, dirty coal power stations are the power dinosaurs of the 21st century. Even the coal industry recognises that. Brendan, we've seen the closure of Hazelwood. We've seen a number of power plants close over the last few years. Are we seeing the inevitable decline of coal as the major power source in Australia?
No, I think we're seeing the coming to the end of their life of a number of power stations, and we'll see more over the next 13 years. We expect another 8 or so gigawatts of coal-fired power to come out of the system, but just because of the natural end of their life. So it's what we replace that with is now the question for Australian energy policy.
If the argument was just about energy security, coal's dominance would be assured. It produces synchronous power, reliable, steady, constant and predictable. Australia has been heavily invested in coal.
Australia was colonised in 1788. The first shipment of coal out was in 1797. This is deeply embedded into our political, cultural, administrative, as well as economic culture. And it's a big deal.
And the federal government continues to enthusiastically back coal.
As the world's largest coal exporter, we have a vested interest in showing that we can provide both lower emissions and reliable baseload power with state-of-the-art, clean coal-fired technology.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal.
In a decarbonising world, the future for coal will have to be in reducing emissions. But how realistic is the idea of clean coal?
We believe that coal-fired power generation around the world has transformed in the last 20 years. We believe there is a strong future for it in this country.
The supporters of new coal generation in Australia point to a high-efficiency, low-emissions plant in Japan. But even that only reduces emissions by 25% compared to today's average coal plant output. The real leap for clean coal technology lies with carbon capture and storage.
You never remove 100% of the CO2. So typically, we target 80 to 90% removal. So there'll always be some level of residual emissions, but it can achieve deep levels of decarbonisation.
I think, what people here want to know is whether it is even possible in Australia to do it.
Look, my view on this would be it's technically doable, but absent policies and a price mechanism that supports it, it's not possible today. Could it be possible in the future? I think it could be.
Let's be honest, things need to change. So at AGL, we are getting out of coal.
But carbon price or not, AGL is one big power company that's already decided there is no long-term future in coal. The company says it will be out of coal completely by 2050.
But this is just the beginning.
People have said no one's going to invest in any new coal. Now, I think that's a shortcut for saying unless the circumstances are right.
After a decade of heated debate about a carbon price, only one scheme has emerged with broad support, an emissions intensity scheme designed by Danny Price.
Yeah, it's actually very simple in concept. What it's trying to do is change the relative cost of low emission generators, which tend to be higher than the costs of high emission generators. And so the way we do that is effectively lower the costs of the low emission generators like renewables and gas by requiring the high emission generators like coal to be able to buy a certificate from those clean generators to run. If you're above the baseline, you have to buy certificates. If you're below it, you get a credit. And that baseline can just be inched down over time to achieve the ultimate target under the Paris Agreement, which is a net zero emission by about 2050.
Until last December, an EIS was being seen as the best chance to reach a consensus on carbon pricing. The Labor opposition, many big investors, the CSIRO, environmental groups, even the National Farmers Federation now support the idea. Some of the country's biggest energy companies, including AGL and Origin, also back an EIS. And for a while, many thought the government did too.
The electricity sector.
In an interview in December, the minister made it clear an EIS was still a live option.
We know that there's been a large number of bodies that have recommended an emissions intensity scheme, which is effectively a baseline and credit scheme. We'll look at that.
So any chance of that applying?
Well, we'll just wait and see. We want to hear from the experts.
But 2 days after his minister publicly aired the idea, the Prime Minister killed it, following threats of a backbench revolt from MPs who remain opposed to any form of carbon pricing.
We will not be imposing an emissions trading scheme, however it's called, and an emissions intensity scheme is an emissions trading scheme. That's just another name for it.
Four Corners has been told by many in the industry that privately the government had led them to believe it would be moving to an EIS.
Most people were expecting the 2017 review to come out with an emissions intensity scheme as its centrepiece. And
because they were being told that.
Because they were being told that by informally, I guess, by by the government, and certainly all the industry had an expectation because they believe that was what that they were being told.
Where has that left them then? The industry, where has it left all these people who are...
It's the industry's basically shattered. I mean, they're basically now paralysed in terms of what to do with their investments as they stand. They don't know how much they should spend on maintenance of old plant. They don't know what to spend in terms of meeting the growing needs of the market and to try and respond to the prices.
The South Australian government also believed an EIS was being actively considered by the federal government after a briefing from the chief scientist, Alan Finkel.
In the week leading up to the COAG meeting in December, Dr. Alan Finkel briefed all of the state's energy ministers, including the federal energy minister, Josh Frydenberg, about the way in which an emissions intensity scheme would work, chapter and verse. And it was promoted in a way which suggested it would be advocated by the federal government. We walked away from that meeting thinking that we would be seeing an emissions intensity scheme presented at COAG.
That is a complete fabrication, and that's just troublemaking by probably some of my Labor state colleagues.
So it didn't happen?
Didn't happen.
You never talked about an EIS in that sort of detail?
Well, we have never said that an EIS is the government's policy. I've never given anyone that indication.
The lack of a carbon price in any form has had some serious market consequences. A decade of lost investment in crucial energy infrastructure.
Well, interestingly, even the fossil fuel industry is increasingly been looking for a clear carbon signal. Many of the fossil fuel businesses, not just energy, are also saying we need clarity because we can't invest. We can't invest, for example, in technologies that will reduce emissions from coal and gas. So everybody is saying that they need a credible, longer-term policy to see how things are going to unfold.
Look, there are plenty of board members I know and people in the industry who don't believe in climate science but would dearly love to see a carbon price in place because they know that it's essential for better outcomes in the market.
We've always supported the notion of putting a price on carbon. That's something we've always believed, and an emissions intensity scheme is one very good way of doing it. We've always operated on some key principles around putting a price on carbon as how best to do it. But it seems to us, the more that you look at it, that an EIS is perhaps the best way to go and has always been the best way to go. We haven't seen a better solution to the problem than that.
As the energy mix changes, gas has been seen as the bridge to a low-carbon future. Cleaner than coal, more constant than renewables. Of all the policy failures that plague the Australian energy market, those surrounding gas are among the most alarming. In the next few years, Australia will become the world's biggest exporter of gas. In fact, we're exporting so much of it, we no longer have enough to supply our own domestic market. And Australian gas is sometimes cheaper in Japan than it is here. The construction of the massive export terminals in Gladstone in Queensland in 2009 allowed gas companies along the east coast to export their gas for the first time. The Queensland Labor government and the Gillard government both ignored warnings that this could result in big price rises and a shortfall for domestic consumption.
Blind Freddy saw this coming. It's only those who are neglectful or deceitful or those who just didn't want to face the problem who haven't known that this has been coming for a long time. We've had a catastrophic failure of national policy making and we've had a catastrophic failure of a national energy market. In fact, you could argue that we don't have a national energy market. I think what's happened here is that with the way our federation works, that our political masters have either been unable to or unwilling to address this problem.
Dave Carney's metal treatment factory here in the industrial suburbs of Melbourne is just one face of an escalating industrial crisis. Even if he can afford the gas, Dave Carney is having trouble securing even a short-term contract for supply.
The difference for us will be this year, this financial year, we will go from last financial year a $500,000 a year contract of gas. We'll pay about $750,000 this financial year. Next financial year, we're looking at about a $1.2 million gas bill.
What sort of impact is that having on your business?
Huge. It's an uncontrolled and sudden shock to our business.
The crisis has seen big companies like BlueScope and BHP warn of an impending energy catastrophe. There's now a real danger that some small and large businesses could be forced to shut or move offshore.
Big parts of Australian industry are now looking over the precipice. What was once a huge competitive advantage for Australia has now become a millstone around industry's neck. We're seeing gas prices double and triple and more than triple. We're seeing electricity prices more than double. It wouldn't be surprising if some big companies just made a decision to shut the doors and walk away sometime soon unless this is fixed.
It's an economic disaster in the making. It's not that it's forecast, it is happening. We're seeing businesses whose viability is seriously under question.
We're the lucky country, but at the moment it seems that we're giving away most of, if not all of our competitive advantages.
The Turnbull government has now threatened to restrict exports in an effort to force producers to boost supply for the domestic market. It's designed to reduce wholesale gas prices and bring them back at least to the global market price. The regulator also says it's prepared to intervene and ensure gas supply and gas generation is available at peak demand.
We have the authority to do that, but we will be working with the governments as well. But I think the thing that we discovered last summer is that you can't wait for the day of a peak to talk to a generator and say, I need you to turn on. So what we're doing in our preparations and working with the gas suppliers and then the gas generators is to be able to notify them well in advance of the peak that we expect them to be on to make sure the gas is where we need it to be on the day we need it.
The search for reliable power is now being directed at the rapidly advancing storage and battery technologies. The Lakeland project in far north Queensland is the first project of its kind to couple solar with batteries and lock into the grid. For this story, we've travelled to the fringes of the grid, from Port Lincoln in the far southwest to here in far north Queensland. The environments might be different, but the issues are the same. The national electricity grid is fragile. And while politicians might argue about the benefits of a new coal-fired power station or how much renewable energy to put into the system, global energy companies are seeing a market opportunity now.
What we're creating is a baseload power generator. However, what's different is that we're locating that generation right where the demand is needed. A lot of the problems with solar, as we all know, is that if clouds come over, if the sun doesn't shine, it is intermittent power. Having this battery perfectly matched to it will enable that smoothing to happen. So if the grid is looking at this project, in effect, it will only see a stable power supply.
The project has been developed with some funding from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, but the majority of the finance has been raised from institutional investors looking for returns that will deliver for 20 or 30 years. Coal is struggling to attract investors here. Solar isn't.
Our typical investor is, for the likes of a superannuation or a pension fund, it's really an investor that is seeking a stable return, a fixed profile of return over a defined term.
The solar companies believe installations like this will eventually be the answer for even big cities on the edge of the grid like Cairns. But even some of the battery optimists say it could be 10 years before they can totally transform our energy system and power our bigger cities. South Australia needs an answer now.
We could do a lot by next summer. You can put in a big battery system by next summer if decisions are taken relatively soon. We can't scratch around for another 6 months and expect things to be all right for next summer. But
Ross Garno has moved from advisor to market player. He's joined Zen Energy, founded by tech entrepreneur Richard Turner. Zen is one of many companies, including Tesla, now vying for the contract to build a 100 megawatt lithium battery storage plant in South Australia. The Zen project will be the size of a football field.
What we need is a future of very large-scale renewables, and a diversity of renewables is the vision. So what we need is large-scale wind farms, large-scale solar farms, large-scale pumped hydro, and the big battery works between the three of them to produce a nice regular flow of energy and meet the intermittency between them.
The combination of batteries and an intermittent power source can give you a 24/7 power source. So ultimately, with enough batteries, you can certainly run a grid with no use of fossil fuels at all. Clearly, we're on a journey to there from here. But I think we're absolutely approaching the point now when we're close to having built our last baseload power generator.
Simon Hackett is a former internet entrepreneur who's now turned his tech expertise to batteries. He's an enthusiastic believer in a battery-powered future in all its forms, and a big fan of Tesla technology for cars. He's backing an Australian-developed battery for homes and industry. So tell us, how does this differ from a Tesla battery, for instance?
These are globally unique batteries. This is called a zinc bromide flow battery, and it's designed to work hard every day. You can completely charge it, completely discharge it without damage. If you do that to any other battery, you'll wreck it. The more batteries are made, the cheaper they get. If they're not cheap enough for you this year, they will be within 5. There are companies starting to produce software that let you stitch all these batteries together into being one kind of super battery in a community.
Like everyone in the battery business, Simon Hackett says the technology is on the cusp of a big advance. The next leap will see the development of smart domestic batteries that link up and store and share power.
As you add batteries, all of us can become a power station. So the power gets generated right around the entire national grid, right where consumers are, and my excess power that I harvested today can be delivered to my neighbour, not just to me, tonight. And just like the internet, it's software that holds it together, because it's software that will allow these large groups of batteries to function like a big power generation system right in the suburb where you need it.
Last summer was bad. The next summer, and the one after, could be even worse. The answer for our energy security problems over the longer term, though, is a mix of technology. Renewables, batteries, pumped hydro, gas, and perhaps cleaner coal. It's a daunting challenge.
You can't find many places in the world where they've successfully managed this change with the high levels of intermittency we're talking about. It's not an anti-renewable argument, it's a managing intermittency challenge. This is an enormous transition, and I think it's very important that we keep a very clear head on what is ahead of us, and don't let either ideology get in the way of progress or hold us back.
Out on the edges of the national grid, in places like Port Lincoln, consumers are wary. They just want the lights to stay on and for politicians to start speaking truth to power.
Everyone keeps blaming everyone else, and I would love, as a consumer of electricity, I'd love both sides of government to come out and just find a solution rather than blame everyone else. So we blame this, we blame that, but it's just time we had a solution.
A review of the electricity sector now being conducted by the chief scientist, Alan Finkel, will be released next month. Four Corners understands it will report that Australians are now paying the price for a lack of decisive action on energy policy. The Finkel review is looking at options to encourage investment in energy, including a possible carbon pricing mechanism restricted to the electricity market. That's all for tonight. See you next time.